Hey there, dear friends. Tonight, first of all, I just want to take a moment for an egregious error I made last week. I didn't say our name correct. Oh, these things happen, even to perfect people such as I. Ha 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 ha. Not really. So, tonight, I want to welcome you to the Take Three Theological Variety Hour, in which we are going to have a discussion about various topics. Actually, it's going to be a great episode. And this is Erica. I am here with Seth and Christine, or Christine and Seth, if you want to do it alphabetically. And Seth tonight is going to talk about Saint Nicholas, since we're coming up on Christmas season. Sometimes Saint Nicholas is associated with Santa Claus, but he's going to tell you the truth about Saint Nicholas. Then we're going to go over to Christine, who is going to give us the background on Arianism. Oh, that's a great word. We're going to find out exactly what Arius did and why people were so peeved about it. Also, discussing the Council of Nicaea. That is going to be a battle royal. After that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Advent calendars, and even throw in a movie. And finally, we are going to have some shameless plugs about our new publications. So, with that, welcome, welcome. We are so happy to have you with us, and I'm going to turn this over to Seth for our St. Nicholas discussion.
Hey everybody. um, so I am still getting over my month-long plague, so I apologize that my voice sounds weird. Well, it may sound weird all the time, but sounds weirder than usual. We're going to talk about St. Nicholas today, and St. Nicholas's feast day is coming up at the end of this week. It is actually on Friday. So um, some people in the U.S. and also in other countries, more so in other countries, I think, will be celebrating tomorrow night by putting out their shoes so that St. Nicholas can fill them with presents and candy and all sorts of things. So, where does that tradition come from? That's probably not something that I have a lot of knowledge to speak on. St. Nicholas himself, the real life St. Nicholas, we don't really know that whole lot about. Like, he's one of these saints who definitely existed, unlike some other saints, but we don't know a whole lot about who he was. We know that he was the bishop of Myra in Asia Minor. And then after that, there are a whole lot of traditions about him, but none of them are super firmly rooted in historical fact. So, and then, of course, as Erica mentioned, we have him kind of conflated with this Father Christmas figure, and he becomes Santa Claus, and so that's probably a whole other podcast. But so we're going to talk about the quote unquote real St. Nicholas, the truth about St. Nicholas, as Erica said. So I feel I have a lot of responsibility right now to give you the truth. Um, so traditions about St. Nicholas are that the earliest traditions about him are that he came from a wealthy family, and one of the most famous stories about him, famous enduring stories, is that he tried to help the daughters of a nobleman who had fallen on hard times. He tried to help his daughters out of poverty. They were facing, having to become prostitutes, actually, is how the story goes. And he, in the middle of the night, would throw bags of gold into their house so that they could survive and wouldn't have to, it's either bags of gold or prostitution. So Nicholas saved them by throwing the bags of gold into their house. And then I guess on the third night, someone caught him. Anyway, so that's how we know that it was him. There's also traditions that he saved some young men who had fallen afoul of the emperor. He interceded for them and saved these men from execution. And there's also a tradition that he was able to bilocate and appeared to some sailors who were caught in a storm on the ocean and saved them from certain death. this kind of miraculous appearance to them. So that's pretty much, those are the earliest traditions about him. Those are the traditions that show up in the Golden Legend. There are also a lot of other traditions about St. Nicholas that are newer, and so maybe a little bit less historically rooted. One of which is that he was at the Council of Nicaea and slapped Arius in the face. So this is something that has gotten a lot of traction on social media in the last few years, I've noticed. Like, people have like
Oh, the
drawing,
memes.
yeah, memes of like Nicholas punching Arius in the face. Now, I love them. I think they're hilarious, but it did not actually happen, most likely. And we actually don't even know if Nicholas was at the Council of Nicaea. Some of the lists of bishops who attended have Nicholas on there, and others don't. Their scholarship thinks that perhaps the ones that do have him on there, he was added at a later date. They're like, oh, Nicholas isn't on here. Let's write him in. So the most glaring evidence that he may not, he very well could have been there because he was a bishop. He was a bishop of a city in Asia Minor. So there's no reason like he wouldn't have been there. But of the 1,800 bishops who were invited, there are varying estimates of how many went, but it's usually thought to be about 300 or 400. Although many delegations were ones that were in the East. So Nicholas very well could have been there, but something that kind of weights on the side that he may not have been is that none of the main players at the Council of Nicaea, specifically Athanasius, mention him at all. And they definitely don't mention him striking anyone. So,
Wait. So you mean to tell me that there was no big brawl where St. Nicholas just like jumped over the table and started wailing on Arius?
no, it didn't.
Ah.
However, so there is, and so I'm speaking from a Western Catholic point of view here. There is a strong tradition in the East, an iconographic tradition of Nicholas doing this at the Council of Nicaea. So many like icons of Nicholas that have scenes of his life around a border will have that in there. And there's actually one that I'm going to share with you guys that we can maybe post on our social media of Nicholas full hand slapping Arius in the face. Now, the reason that it definitely didn't happen to Arius is because the earliest story of this instance, which is, again, hundreds of years after the council took place, Nicholas doesn't punch Arius. He actually gives like a fraternal slap of correction to an Arian bishop. And then the story, as it was embellished, became Arius himself. And then ultimately, the final form is that it not only was a slap, but it was like a punch like a knockout.
Okay. Wait. Can we talk about this phrase, fraternal slap of correction?
Yes.
Okay,
Now,
that is the best. I'm going to use that all the time now.
I've never heard of that before. When I was doing research on this aspect, because I was really interested in this, especially because it's gotten so popular, like this, Nicholas punching Arius thing. When I was doing research, I don't remember which source I was looking at, but the source said that yes, the initial story is that it was kind of like this correctional slap, so sort of like a symbolic slap rather than like a brawl. And I think that maybe what we could maybe correspond it to is how with the sacrament of confirmation, the bishop used to slap the confirmandi, and it wasn't like a haul off and backhand them. It was just like a slap to signify that taking on this identity of Christian will put you at odds with the world.
So it's like Mr. T's I Pity the Fool versus like Steve Austin's Stone Cold Stunner, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's probably good. So, so unfortunately or fortunately, Arius did not, or Nicholas did not punch out Arius in the face. The rest of that story, though, that is not present in a lot of the memes, is that in that version of the story, Nicholas is stripped of his title of bishop for a while and thrown in prison because of what he does to Arius. So, and then Christ and the Virgin Mary appear to him and, give him his mitre back or his pallium. So it's most likely an apocryphal story. There another tradition that likely didn't happen, that's very popular in Nicholas's legend, is that he saved 3 young boys who had been killed by a butcher and then pickled in brine so that the butcher could sell them as pickled meat.
Wow.
And
I love
apparently
how morbid and creepy that is.
it's
That's like a Grimm's fairy tale version of St. Nicholas.
yeah, or like a horror movie. But so Nicholas learns of this scheme, and like whose demented mind thought the story up? But anyway, Nicholas learns of this scheme, and he goes and raises these pickled and butchered children from the dead. And so a lot of images, particularly older images, like holy cards and iconography of Nicholas from the West, will have him with like 3 little boys in this wash tub looking type thing. And that's
I
where,
thought he was just cleaning them. He pickled them?
well, Nicholas didn't pickle them. The butcher did, because he'd fallen on hard times and didn't have meat to sell. So he was going to,
So this is the real origin of the glass pickle Christmas ornament tradition.
oh,
This
No,
conversation
because
took a turn.
have you ever heard about that?
I've seen the pickle like at the,
And I always thought it was like a fake tradition, and it probably is. But now you can like totally amp up.
oh, that's true. You could, yeah, you
You
could,
could totally be like, this is in memorial of the 3 boys who were taken by the butcher.
yeah. So that's another very popular, very visual, iconographically visual memory, quote unquote, memory of Nicholas. But again, none of that is, all of that is later embroidery of his story. So something I was thinking about is Nicholas is an incredibly popular saint. Like, he's perhaps one of the most popular. I think, beyond the Catholic world, people know who St. Nicholas is, just like he's been taken up into popular culture, but we don't know anything about him. And it's like, there must be something that set him apart, that people, venerated him after his death. And the analog that I thought of is, like, if you read the story of, well, I don't know, if you read the biography of Mother Teresa, there's probably not like a whole lot of like blow your hair back events in her life story. But anyone who was alive during the time she was alive and like saw her on the news and saw like how, self-sacrificing and, how kenotic her life was. She just served the poor. And of course, there's people who think she was a total sham, but we won't get into that. But, after she died, people were like, this was a saint. She's a living saint. And so I kind of think of that way about these saints that we don't know anything about. It's like the people who lived with them thought that they were holy. So
Isn't that one of the early processes of canonization? It wasn't a formal process. It was really by acclamation that,
mm-hmm.
A lot of, the whole people would be like, yep, that person, that man, that woman.
Exactly. And so even though we don't have like, some amazing story about the person, that was, their communities thought that they were holy people. So another thing that I ran across in doing some research on Nicholas is that his body was stolen. His relics were stolen This is one of my favorite topics, the mostly medieval phenomenon of
I
what's
was just learning about this, but when the Venetian merchant stole the relics of St. Mark from Alexandria.
exactly. Well, so totally the same deal here. The merchants of Bari stole the relics of Saint Nicholas because the Venetians were gonna come and get them, and the merchants of Bari were like, no, we're gonna get them before the Venetians do. So there's a tradition that the bones of Nicholas exuded a holy oil. So here's your 10-cent word for the day. Nicholas is a miroblite, which is a class of saint whose relics exude a holy oil. Nicholas is probably the most famous one. Another really famous one is Saint Walburga in Germany, whose her relics exude an oil every year, and the nuns of Eichstätt give it out in little ampules. But the translation.
That weren't no oil, honey.
Well, no, it's actually more like water. And they've done tests on the quote unquote oil of, I think it's Walburga that they did a test on. And scientifically, it's no different than water. But people have experienced, miraculous healing through participation in.
I think, Mr. Seth, I think this is a fantastic time to ask you, speaking of relic thievery amongst Italians, where my relic of St. Margaret of Cortona came from exactly.
We're not going to do this on air. I told you that I would tell you on my deathbed where that came from.
Okay, I just had to test the waters.
Yeah, but the fact that I won't tell you shows you that it probably isn't the most above board scenario. But that has you are safe. Like, I have to probably spend time in purgatory because of that. But you're good.
Is this something you had to confess after my birthday?
I did, actually. I confess. Well, you know what? We probably shouldn't talk about that.
Oh, the intrigue.
We probably should.
This is my favorite section we've ever had. First we had the miraculous oil, which was great, and then we just ramped it up to 11, just like that.
Okay, we're not going to talk about the contents of my confessions. The seal of confession is sacred. So what was I talking about? Oh, yes, the theft of the relics of St. Nicholas.
Yes, theft of relics. Let's talk about that.
Yes. So the merchants of Bari took the relics. There are different translation accounts of the relics. Some say that the monks in Myra gave them up willingly because they knew that Nicholas wanted to be translated to Bari. That sounds a little bit suspicious to me. It's probably more like a theft, but what you see in the Middle Ages is whenever these relic thefts take place, there's literature that has to be written to validate what happens. And usually how it goes is the saint appears to someone in a dream and says, hey, I don't want to be, so Nicholas appears to the merchants of Bari and says, I don't want to be in Myra anymore. Come and take my relics to Bari. So that's exactly what the translation narratives say. But in reality, most likely what happens is the merchants of Bari heard that the Venetians were going to come and steal them, and so they went and stole them before the Venetians could get there. Because the Venetians had already stolen St. Mark, so the merchants of Bari felt like they needed to be able to, compete somehow.
Well, there was big commercial reasons that the Venetians did that, and I'm sure the merchants of Bari, between not wanting Venice to get another leg up on the trade and commerce, get that piece for themselves.
And there's a very good discussion of this. So one of my favorite books in the whole world is a book called Forta Sacra by Patrick J. Geary that talks about this kind of phenomenon of relic thefts. It's a rather short book, but it's very good and interesting and chock full of information. And there's a whole section on St. Nicholas if you want to check it out. I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in that sort of thing. One last thing I will say, and it's just a quick pet peeve, is that I have seen liturgically at Christmas Mass someone dressed up as, not St. Nicholas, dressed up as Santa Claus come in during midnight Mass to venerate the Christ child. And I'm like, what is going on here? Like, what does that even mean? Because I don't know. I just had to throw that in there as like, don't do that.
Or do you suppose the person is trying to make a point with the whole keep Christ in Christmas, and that Santa being an iteration of Saint Nicholas is like, I can kind of see what they might be doing it poorly, of course, but like
that's my point. I know what they're doing, but I think it's stupid.
Yeah, fair. Because I know, like, the churches around where I am, they'll do, like, the St. Nicholas Mass, and usually it's the Sunday or the Saturday night or the Sunday night closest to the feast day of St. Nicholas.
Mm-hmm.
And St. Nicholas will, show up, but he's dressed as a bishop, like he's got on a mitre, and it may be red and green themed, but he's, got the crozier and the mitre and all of that.
If St. Nicholas shows up on St. Nicholas Day, which is 19 days before Christmas, that's fine.
Yeah.
But when he shows
the
up,
guy in New Orleans.
Okay, yes, and walks the streets and hands out candy, that's great. I think that's awesome. He can even put candy in my shoe. I don't care. But like, if Santa Claus in his red furry suit shows up at midnight Mass, I'm like, this is liturgically problematic. All right, my rant is over. Now let's talk about the Council
but fair.
of Nicaea.
So before we get into my rant on the Council of Nicaea, I just wanted to add. So that's I understand that you have a beef with Santa showing up at midnight Mass for Christmas. What about, I don't know if you've seen like the creche or nativity scenes where they'll have everybody there, but then there's also like a Santa and he's kneeling with his hat in his hand, praying. Have you seen that?
I have seen that. Again, I think whatever. But there's a tradition, there's a very long tradition of having these sort of, ancillary characters involved in the creche. So
yeah, like the drummer boy.
The drummer boy. There's the tradition in Italy of La Befana, which is a witch who brings presents. So, and I think that maybe she shows up in the creche. There's another tradition where there's like this kind of scary figure that is also in the nativity scene. I don't remember what it is. But I vaguely remember reading about that. So that doesn't bother me as much as like something that is blatantly out of place in the middle of a liturgy.
While we're talking about creche problems, what bothers me is that people put their magi there on Christmas.
Oh, I know.
And you know what, people? The Christmas season extends beyond Christmas. I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, okay, quote unquote Christmas.
Well,
the magi were not there on Christmas.
Yes, but are you just gonna like have them up there for Epiphany Day and then take it all down?
I
like they get one day with Jesus.
I used to move them closer across the house.
That's what you're supposed to do. Remember, that's what they did at Loyola. They would start over by and then they'd gradually move closer.
The weeping angels only playing it with the magi, basically. Or like Holy Elf on a Shelf. That's what I'm going to create, something Holy Elf on a Shelf. But yes, the magi.
Can it please be better than the Elf on the Shelf, because I'm just honestly not a fan.
Like Snoop on the Stoop.
Man, that was hilarious. Make sure that you put that picture up on social media so people know what we're talking about.
Yes, folks, if you want to find Snoop on the Stoop, I will put it up on social media for you. Because,
that was legit. Well, no, it was totally not legit. That was the whole point. Okay. Segue. This is going to be awkward as heck, but I'm going to take it. So
Snoop to Arius.
Erica mentioned the weeping angels, which, as some of you fellow nerds know, were some villains during the David Tennant era of Doctor Who. Well, also in Doctor Who, there's an audio adventure featuring Peter Davison where the Doctor goes back in time to the Council of Nicaea. I've not actually listened to it yet, but my dad actually lent it to me. I'm hoping to listen to it as soon as I have a couple of hours. But it's an audio adventure Doctor Who episode at the Council of Nicaea. And the reason we're doing the Council of Nicaea is because as Seth was doing St. Nicholas, and we have that whole story about St. Nicholas being at the Council of Nicaea and physically assaulting Arius. Yes, that does meet the legal requirements for assault and battery, but apparently Seth says it didn't even happen. It was all hearsay. But so the heresy of the week that I'm tackling this week is Arianism. And Arianism is an early Christological heresy. And it basically comes down to this idea of, at the time, and this was end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century, so Arius, who is the first kind of the guy whom this heresy is named after, lived from 250 to 336. And he taught that Jesus was the Son was not equal to God the Father, which at the time, like, it became really controversial. But it's kind of weird because you would think that it would be controversial in relationship to an established teaching, but what you find out when you read into this is that what comes out of the Council of Nicaea is not a belief that was taught prior to the Council of Nicaea. So I realize I'm kind of doing this out of order. So what happens is Arius, we don't have a lot of what Arius actually taught because so many of his writings after the Council of Nicaea were burned. Really all we have is what his opponents say about him, which is always kind of a sketchy source. But what we've been able to pull out is that the main dispute between Arianism and then what ends up becoming Trinitarianism is the following 2 questions. Has the Son always existed from before time next to the Father? Or was the Son begotten at a certain time way far in the eternal past? And then, as sort of a corollary to that, is the Son equal to the Father or subordinated to the Father? So think about that, the minute differences in time and hierarchy that we're talking about. Both positions were able to fall back on scripture. The Arians didn't say that it wasn't like, oh, Jesus is just a man, so ignore him. It wasn't like that at all. That their belief was that Jesus was the firstborn of all creation, that somewhere back in the far distant past, God begot the Son. And then through the Son, everything else is made. So still on the hierarchy of being, in terms of like how one prays, in terms of how one approaches the divine, from a layperson's perspective, I really don't see that much practical difference. I can understand this being a subject of great debate. I love speculative theology. I believe I mentioned in our first episode, that's one of my favorite pastimes. But what happened was it didn't stay speculative. That people started saying, Arius was saying, no, the way I'm seeing it, it's that the Father begat the Son before time even began, which calls into question his understanding of the nature of time, but maybe I can go into that at some other point. that got other people up in arms. And by up in arms, I mean they caused such a ruckus between these, not two camps, because each camp had variations on what they were teaching. So it was more like 6 to 8 camps. They caused so much trouble that the Emperor Constantine, who had already decided that Christianity was going to become the new norm, the official new religion of the empire, he caught his attention. This guy he's got an empire to run, and he was the general of the armies, and really, so he has to literally call all these opposing sides to Rome and do the equivalent of locking them all in their room until they sort their differences out. And because that's what he did. He actually called the Council of Nicaea, not any of the bishops. And he told them, sort this out. Just do it. Work this out. So the Council of Nicaea doesn't even really fix it. They come out with some pronouncements, basically condemning Arius, condemning any of the bishops that support him, and including 2 bishops who won't disavow him, but they'll sign on to the document condemning Arianism, but they won't condemn Arius, so they get kicked into exile. All these bishops go into exile, but even then they keep waffling about it. Down the line, there's some initial reconciliation. They call the bishops back. They say, oh, you can come back now. But Arius dies along the way. And apparently there's some thought that he might possibly have been poisoned. But we don't have, I don't know that we have a lot of evidence for that. But it is awfully convenient. Really, when I was reading about all of this, the only person who comes out looking good is Constantine. All of the rest of them are wrestling with issues that, while fascinating to play around with in our heads and try to work out, it really seems like all of them forgot what should be the bishops and the theologians' first admonition, when Paul reminds us that now we see through a glass darkly. There are things beyond our pay grade. There are things we cannot know for certain. We can speculate all we want and have a lot of fun speculating, but there are things absolutely we cannot know for certain. Now, today in our modern age, because Trinitarianism is absolutely the norm and has been for so long, it's very hard for people to consider any other possible view as ever having been valid. But at the time that the Council of Nicaea happened, and just before it, Arius's point of view and the root of what became the Trinitarian points of view, those were both held as equally orthodox. The issue hadn't been settled. It was only with the Council of Nicaea that suddenly half of what half of the people think is suddenly not only wrong, but considered vile and wicked and had to be scrubbed from the face of the earth.
I mean, like, when you have to kidnap people to get to your councils so that you can vote in, I'm just going to say that's a little suspicious.
There was, Yeah, and the more I was reading about it and, like, all the different, it's not even 2 sides. There were, okay, so there's the Homoousians, and please, if you know Greek, forgive me. Greek is not a language I study. I study Russian and Japanese and French and a little bit of Latin. You notice that Greek is not on that list, so forgive terrible pronunciation. The Homoousians taught that the Son is of the same substance as the Father, therefore they're both uncreated. That's the idea that becomes eventually the modern Trinitarian idea. But then you also had the people who followed Marcellus of Ancyra and Photinus of Sirmium, who taught that Christ was just a man. Then you have the Homoousians. Again, please forgive that pronunciation, who taught that the Son is of a similar substance to the Father, but not the same. You had the Homoians, who taught that the Son is similar to the Father, either in all things or according to the Scriptures, but they don't talk about the substance of, what makes up the Son versus what makes up God, just that he's similar in all ways. Then you have the Heterousians, who taught that the Son is of a different substance than the Father, therefore, a created being. And that's really the closest to what Arius taught. But then there were a bunch of other people who, in the Council of Nicaea, had critics of the creed that came out. And each side, we have documented roughly the size of a football team, American National League football team. And that's just of the people who are documented as having had a side. So it was basically a big mismatch. And again, it all comes down to something that from the lay perspective is a minor detail. And at least from the way I'm seeing it, wouldn't really change the way a lay person at the very least would approach prayer, the sacraments, the church, God. It might have some effect on maybe some of the official prayers in the Mass, maybe, and I feel like I'm stretching even for that. But it's really a fine detail that they caused a ruckus about and felt that they had to get as a firm doctrine, even though it is not only beyond any of their understanding, it's beyond any of our understanding. There's not going to be a way for any human to understand the nature of God, to understand the nature of how Jesus, the Son, relates to God the Father, especially when both of the major camps can point to the Bible, can point to Scripture and say, well, Scripture says this, Scripture says this other thing. The fact is, Scripture isn't exactly clear, and it can't be clear in such a way that it would spell it out for us, just because we don't have the mental capacity, because sin clouds our understanding. It's not going to happen. So the real problem with the Council of Nicaea, and not just Nicaea, honestly, is the need of a lot of the church fathers to definitize that which should not have been definitized. I think it did a disservice to the faithful to say that you know things for sure that you cannot possibly know for sure. Because now, by basically writing these things in stone, you're cutting off any possibility of any further understanding down the line. You're painting yourself into a corner, and even worse, you're kind of painting God into that corner too, because let's say they just left it up in the air and they said, you know what, we don't know. It's above our pay grade. And then 1,000 years later, some nun in Germany or some anchoress in, I don't know, Norwich has a vision where God makes things a little clearer. Well, that can only happen, and the church can only acknowledge that it's real if they haven't already excluded that possibility. And I'm not saying that I think necessarily that the Arians were right. What I am saying is that I think the proceedings of the Council of Nicaea, from what I saw, were not what we would consider an actual solid debate, because apparently no one realized that it was all speculation anyway. And that would have to be the foundation of where you start. And if you don't start with that, everything else is just pride. Everything else is just needing to be right more than needing the truth, whatever the truth may be. Again, I'm not saying that in terms of what actually came out of Nicaea was wrong, but I'm saying that after having read about it some, I assumed going in, of course, the great fathers of the church and the early bishops took this seriously and humbly and really prayed over it and had discussions. And the more I see, no, they were just guys who had all the same flaws in their thinking and behavior that, well, most of your academics have today. Yeah. And coming from someone who is incredibly skeptical of the academy in general, and I see a lot of the same behaviors, and I see this again and again and again throughout time, throughout culture. If you want to talk about God, if you want to speculate on the nature of God, that's great. I'm down. Let's do it. But you have to start with acknowledging that everything is speculative. You have to start with acknowledging your limitations as a mortal being. And if you don't, as I said, if you don't start with that, you're not going to get anywhere productive.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's something that's cool about that whole dynamic is that, you know, these we think about these church fathers and think of them sort of like as these infallible theologians, but they're people, you know,
Yeah.
and they're sort of fumbling towards the truth just like we are. One point I wanted to make that you touched on, Christine, though, is that really what happens at the Council of Nicaea is an innovation on Christian beliefs. Because like you said, you know, there's this tradition of worshiping Christ, which is biblical. There's also this tradition of relating Christ to the Greek philosophical concept of the logos.
Yes.
Which I think is what Arius was doing. And I think prior theologians had done the same thing, but they just weren't, you know, born at the right time to get embroiled in this controversy. But really, the fathers at Nicaea introduced that term homoousios, which is not biblical. They had to come up with it. So the real innovation there, and that's part of the reason it was so controversial, is because it's not biblical language, and it was developed at the council to try to come to a consensus about the nature of Christ.
I saw that, and I was also seeing that, like, they didn't even really, the whole idea of the doctrines on the Holy Spirit, even after Nicaea, really weren't developed in the way that we think of them today. That still wasn't even worked out at the time. So what we think of as the Trinitarian idea maybe had its start with Nicaea, but it really wasn't even fully formed with Nicaea.
No, and they don't really even take up the Holy Spirit until the Council of Constantinople in 381. And really, they're fighting about this Christology until the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And even there's fights after Chalcedon, but Chalcedon is kind of like the limiting, you know, the line in the sand of how you can talk about Christ in an orthodox way, even though there are some issues, Christological issues that take place afterwards. But like, these aren't things that were worked out even in a century. They took a long time for the church to grapple with. And when you're talking about them, it's really hard sometimes, especially when you're teaching undergrads about these issues. Sometimes it's hard to keep straight in your mind what each position is, because a lot of the times they're really similar.
Yeah. And again, it's these very fine differences of idea that, I mean, so what I'm thinking of is, if you caught the attention of the emperor, there had to have been like riots or something. Like somebody was sending their followers against the followers of somebody else. Because otherwise, if you're just like standing around in, you know, rectories yelling at each other, no one really cares. The emperor's just like, oh, you know, those old guys, whatever. He starts caring when things start destabilizing on the political, military, when it starts becoming a security issue.
One of the Cappadocian fathers, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Gregory of Nyssa. One of them talks about how this argument over Christology, like, got out into the street, like you couldn't go buy a loaf of bread without the baker, like engaging you about what you believed about the nature of the sun. So it became like a very, in the streets kind of
which
issue.
Kind of boggles my mind, because I'm thinking as a layperson that yes, I'm interested in this idea, and I would love discussing it, but for it to get to a point where I'm a baker that is quizzing people and saying, oh, I can't sell you this bread unless you answer the question correctly. I'm not generally coming up with that entirely on my own. There's somebody telling me this is this big a deal, that you really, you shouldn't be having anything to do with those people who believe that, Christ the Son is a different or the same substance. Because as a layperson, I don't know from the practical point of view, and I'm saying practical in terms of my salvation, in terms of how I pray, how I approach God. I'm not certain how much of a difference it makes. Like, why would I care?
That's definitely the point that Athanasius makes in his fight against Arianism, is he makes it a soteriological issue. So regarding salvation, he says if Christ is created, then he can't save us, because a creature can't save a creature. So Christ has to be uncreated, like eternally begotten, because otherwise he can't save us.
Okay, so I get what he's saying, and I wouldn't disagree with it, but it also seems to be a misstatement of what Arius was saying. Because they were saying, yes, Christ was created, but if all things are created through Christ, then that sort of puts Christ into that capacity.
Definitely. And that definitely goes more into the philosophical idea of the Logos, which again was very paired in Christian theology by people like Justin Martyr and Origen. So really, I don't think Arius is doing a whole lot of innovative thinking here. I think what happens is you have a different point of view from Athanasius and Alexander of Alexandria, and then it becomes a big kerfluffle.
Well, and I mean, just to look at a broader picture here, one of the things that we tried to do when I was doing my master's is to look at the different influences on Christianity. And in the end, there was a reason that the Western and the Eastern churches split. And we have fundamental differences between each other. And Athanasius won this fight, but later on, you're going to have some of the Eastern fathers that take a slightly different philosophical bent. And then in 1054, boom, we end up with the Eastern and the Western church. But I find this in studying the theologians of Alexandria, I find, and even other parts of the Greek world, that they really ended up taking a back seat to their Roman counterparts in the end. And maybe more as you go towards Augustine and even later than that. Just in research, I find they became a little bit more mainstream versus the Greek thought that took place with the Logos. And to the point where even talking to some very educated Catholics, the Logos is a philosophical concept that's really hard for them to unpack, because I don't think we spend a lot of time talking about it at all. So and certainly not the Logos in time, being time, the creation of time, how do humans work on time, human time versus God time. Those are all philosophical concepts that I don't think we really teach enough. So I agree with all of you. I agree with both of you. I love Athanasius. I love Arius. But I do definitely think Arius got a bad rap, and I think to call his thinking a heresy is probably an overstep. Not by you guys, of course, but by the powers
in terms of
the powers that were at the time. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think it's definitely just a different perspective on speculation. Whereas we count as a heresy, we earlier couple episodes ago, I was talking about the Manichaeans and how they weren't so much a different heresy as an entirely different religion. In this case, I would say Arianism is, I think you're right, it's a different philosophy on the same subject matter. And it's all speculation, and nothing should have been codified into doctrine, at least not at that point. I think it was too early. And I think, honestly, it's too early now. We're 2,000 years later, and we still have no idea. We're probably not going to have an idea.
Well, even in philosophy, Seth could probably come up with a bunch of people too, but it's the difference between those theologians that base their work on Plato and the theologians that base their work on Aristotle. And you'll see a marked difference between how they form and how they respond to philosophy and to thinking. And I think maybe that's something that we're looking at with Arius. When you look at Thomas Aquinas, he's Aristotelian to the end. And if you look at somebody like Augustine, you're looking at more of Platonic studies, and it makes a difference, So yeah, perspective, right?
Yeah. So I would say for listeners, now that you've heard me have my rant on, this is one rant of many on the early church fathers. Stay tuned for more in later episodes. Absolutely go to Wikipedia, go to Infogalactic, look up Arianism, the Arian controversy. There's a lot of information there. You'll find it interesting. It is fascinating reading all the different interpretations and the sides. If you love political intrigue, you're going to like this. If you like the movie Mean Girls, you're going to find it kind of amusing, because Erica and I have this sort of ongoing joke that there's a Mean Girls meme or GIF for every occasion. And that is true even for the Council of Nicaea. But I would recommend you look into it, see what it's really about, see what was really being taught, and really think about things for yourself. I'm not saying, again, we're not saying that anyone was right or wrong and that you should change your mind about anything. But it is good to know where ideas come from. It is good to know how the doctrines we were raised with, where they came from, how they came into being. Because I think that'll help you understand other points of view and help you understand your own faith a lot better.
Definitely. And also, I mean, it's sort of a million years old now, but like the Da Vinci Code, which was popular while we were in college, so that's almost 20 years ago. But like that particular work of fiction floated kind of this conspiracy theory about the Council of Nicaea that I think people fall for when they don't know what's actually going on.
Absolutely. Because anyone, I have seen a lot of times, people will say, oh, the real church, the real beliefs of the early Christians were suppressed, by the Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea. But when you really look into what Constantine was dealing with, the vast swathe of what was in existence, in different beliefs, but what those beliefs actually were and what was actually considered at the Council of Nicaea, you start to realize how ridiculous all of that is, because most of the churches that I've seen that'll make those claims, there are churches that do that. Most of them, except for the Mormons, are Trinitarian. So right, it's not even like they themselves.
From.
Yeah. So it is good to know what really happened. So it's kind of disappointing too a bit, because a lot of times you hear a lot when you learn about these figures initially, they're always put on pedestals, but they weren't saints until they died. And we can have faith that they were perfected, that they are in heaven. I'm not going to make the claim that any of them weren't holy men, but just realize that they were mortal, they were human, they had all the same weaknesses everybody has today.
There's a scholar, I don't remember who it is, but says that Cyril of Alexandria must have become a saint in the last 10 years of his life, about which we don't have any information because he was such a dick during his recorded life.
And I can absolutely believe that. You've heard, you guys have dealt with some of my complaints about, for instance, St. Jerome. And I'm sure listeners, at some point, you're going to hear me go off on St. Jerome. So it's a fascinating subject. It is interesting to learn about. I encourage you to learn about it. Certainly, if you get into it and you have any questions, you're not understanding something, we've got our social media pages. Hop on, ask away. Seth or Erica will enlighten you. I'll probably crack a joke because that's how we roll. So, yeah, that's the heresy of the week. Erica, what do you have for us this week?
So I am going to talk about Advent, and particularly Advent calendars. But I want to start by talking about where Advent came from, and particularly what does it mean? What does the word Advent mean? So Advent is a word, comes from a Latin word, adventus, which means to come or to arrive. Actually, to arrive is technically, I think, the official first definition of adventus. And to come, advenio, comes a little bit later. But interestingly enough, the number 4 definition in the Oxford Dictionary for adventus is a visit or appearance. So not only with Advent are we talking about the arrival of Christ, the Christ child, we are also talking about visits and appearances. We have an angel appear to Mary. We have the Christ child arriving. We have people arriving in Bethlehem, seeking out this baby that's going to be born, the coming of this king. We have the Magi, who, as you heard my rant before, will arrive by Epiphany, bringing gifts to this new Savior. So Adventus is a time of waiting for the arrival of something very, very special. And I kind of scandalized a catechesis teacher once. She was a very, very sweet but kind of naive person, because when I was pregnant with Alice is an October baby, I told her that I felt like this was my Advent, that I was waiting patiently, maybe impatiently, for the birth of my little girl. So, and she was scandalized because, she seemed to think that I meant the Christ child, and obviously my child is not the Christ child. Yeah, there's that. And I'm sorry for that brief pause, but my daughter was dancing over to the side and it was a big distraction. So I had to put an end to that. Sorry. So Advent. There are 4 Sundays in Advent. For those of you who may not celebrate Advent or participate in it or even know about it, you might be from a different faith. And when we look at the symbols of Advent, there are 3 Sundays that are purple Sundays for us. And if you look at Advent wreaths, the wreaths symbolizing the infinity and the eternity of Christ, and evergreens, obviously also symbolic of being constantly green and never dying and never needing renewal. So we have 3 purple candles that we use, and then we have 1 pink candle. And the pink candle is my favorite because that is Gaudete Sunday. It's always the 3rd Sunday in Advent, and the word Gaudete means to rejoice. So it is the happy, happy Sunday in Advent. Not that the others aren't happy, but they all have their own reflections. And if you go to a Catholic Mass, and this may be true in other Protestant faiths, but I'm not sure, so I'm not going to say definitely. But if you go to a Catholic church during Advent, you will see the priest and the altar and all the liturgical items in whatever color that Sunday is representative of. So you will have purple, and then you'll see a switch over to pink, and then we'll go back to purple for the coming of Jesus. So just a couple interesting facts. Advent started, they believe, it's very hard to trace, but they believe some of its earliest origins were in the 4th century, but that the number of Sundays in Advent did not officially become confirmed until as late as the 10th or 11th century. So it went back and forth, and finally, after Pope Gregory I, we ended up with coming to 4 official Sundays in Advent. And that's what we celebrate now, and it's been that way for quite some time. So different ways to celebrate Advent, and what I'm going to talk about is getting your kids involved in Advent. And one of my absolute favorites is Advent calendars. I am fascinated by them and I love them because you get to open little doors each day. And obviously, we start on December 1st, and the Advent calendars go through to December 24th, Christmas Eve, because on December 25th is the arrival of Christ. And yes, for those of you who are going to remind me that we don't know that Christ was born on December 25th, yes, it's symbolic, okay? We'll just go with that. But over time, when I was a kid, we didn't have many different types of Advent calendars. We had one that hung on our wall, and it was a little mouse. And every day you moved the mouse along in the pocket. It was a cloth. It was a cloth one that hung, and we actually still have it. It's a cloth one that hangs on a doorknob or on a wall. And that was it came from Avon. My mom used to get holiday stuff from Avon. So it came from there, and it was the most exciting thing to be able to get up and move that mouse. Okay, my secret is it's still really, really exciting to move the mouse.
No,
But
okay.
now,
Like, I'm not going to judge you because I grew up with a little, like, each of us would have a different, that we all had, they were the paper ones that had the little doors you would open, and it was a little excerpt of scripture. But they had these like beautiful winter Christmas scenes, and they were like covered in glitter. And my brothers and I, we would each get one, and we'd use the same ones year after year, and we still have them. And same, they're great. I love them. Every single day, you get to, what's behind the next door. It's so exciting.
Yes, there's something magical about Advent calendars. And I think for kids, it helps them move through the Advent season well. So I have one recommendation, and I have a wooden Advent calendar that I ended up buying for my children. My parents years ago owned a Christmas store. It was amazing fun. And while I owned the Christmas store, I was able to help them with purchasing and to look at different products from some of the Christmas companies. And Kurt Adler, Kurt space Adler, is a really big name corporate Christmas company, but they have wonderful ornaments. They have a lot of spiritual, religious, popular, nerdy stuff. Elvis, oh my gosh, Elvis used to sell out like crazy, but not 70s Elvis. Okay, let's make that straight. Early Elvis.
Yeah, he's
wait, did you have an Elvis Advent calendar?
No, we did not have an Elvis Advent calendar.
Okay.
Yeah, but the Advent calendar that I loved
opportunity.
I know. Well, people out there, make your Elvis Advent calendars and sell them on Etsy for $49.95. They will
she's
sell.
Absolutely right. Early Elvis, not later Elvis.
No, don't go there. So, but for my kids, part of what I really wanted was something that tied in the tradition of Advent and the reason what they were waiting for, not just secular. So, and I have secular calendars too. So I'm not telling you not to get a secular calendar. All I'm saying is that it's really nice with young kids to have the ability every day to put a piece of the nativity out. And so the Advent calendar that I have that I really like through Kurt Adler, I think you can find it on Amazon. It is a nativity Advent calendar. So it's wooden. It's beautifully, really, really well made. It is on the expensive side, but you only have to buy it once. And every day they take out a piece of the nativity, and they put it on a magnetic board. And there's so many different things. There are animals. There's Jesus. There's Mary. Of course, Jesus you do on the last possible day, so you would have it on the 24th. And it's really neat for them to see the progression from the first day through the 24th, and to see all of these different pieces and have the opportunity actually to discuss the different pieces and the different important parts to this. So that's the first one. We do, every year I get, I think this year I got them at Menards for $1.99, the chocolate ones, right? Because there's a German tradition of having chocolate in your advent calendar, and it's a lot of fun, and they love doing that. And that's really inexpensive way to celebrate Advent and to be able to open up all those little doors with them. So that's fun too. There are a ton of secular calendars out, and I feel like in the past couple of years, there have been more and more Advent calendars available on the market. My niece has a Harry Potter Funko one that was very neat. And I have seen everything from Marvel to Peppa Pig, Legos. Legos can be pricey. I love Legos, but they're a little pricey. But they have Lego Friends and they have Lego Harry Potter. So however you're going to celebrate, I think is wonderful and is great fun. And certainly there are Advent calendars that are towards the religious side that are not as expensive as Kurt Adler, but it is nice to have the secular and to have a more spiritual, Christ-centered one as well. So that's my recommendation on Advent calendars. I will try and put those links up as well in social media to the Kurt Adler one especially, so that you're able to look at it. My other recommendation is kind of fun. So VeggieTales has a great episode about Saint Nick, and it is on Amazon Prime. You can rent it for $3.99. I think if you want to buy it, it's $20. And if you need a DVD, I think it was retailing for about $8 through Amazon Prime or Amazon, and then Amazon Prime for the videos. What I like about it is VeggieTales is not for any one particular Christian group, but this goes into the history, not the history that Seth was talking about, but this goes into a nicer history of St. Nicholas, but kind of gives the kids an idea of St. Nicholas versus Santa. So you can do both. I'm not saying to take out Santa, but I think it's a really nice episode for them to bring something different in and some different ideas that might help you talk about Advent and connect all of this together for them, particularly your really young kids. So those are my recommendations for this week. I am happy this week. We're talking about Advent, and I kept everything G-rated. So I think you should all be very proud of me.
I am so proud, and I'm proud that we had that flashback to the VeggieTales because they are classic. They are totally family friendly, but they're also really awesome. Like Larry the Cucumber. Come on, man.
Oh my gosh, silly songs with Larry.
Right?
He's one of the best things in this world.
Yeah. So absolutely great for children. I know last episode we had gotten sidetracked and ended up talking about whiskey advent calendars, but it turns out they are all horribly expensive. So I was not able to get one because I was not willing to spend the kind of cash it would take to have one shipped to me that would have a nice variety of whiskeys. So I ended up with a Aldi chocolate calendar. It's truffles. I've been enjoying one a day. It doesn't send me too far off my diet. But yeah, they are enjoyable things. I'm glad to see that I am also seeing more of them. Though I'm not gonna lie, like the super secular ones are kind of weird. Like
it is because so that's my caveat, right? I think it's fine counting down to Christmas, and we have bought secular ones. I think one year we did a Lego one. We've done fun ones. But what are you counting down towards?
Yeah.
Like the holiday. So I don't know. Similar to Seth with the Santa thing, I'm kind of torn on this one. For me, it's a both. I would do both. Also, for those of you who are going to look it up, the official title of that VeggieTales episode is VeggieTales, St. Nicholas, a story of joyful giving. So yes, it's very, very cute. The asparagus and the peas are just adorable. And it teaches kids that vegetables are A-okay. 4.7 out of 5 stars on the rating. And it's 47 minutes. It's not very long. It's got 131 recommendations, 4.5 stars. Hey, that's pretty good. So
Yeah.
if you're gonna
Decent.
do it for your kids, I think it's a good idea. And there's
Wow.
also silly songs at the end that you can sing karaoke style. Who doesn't want to?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's the best.
Karaoke with the kids.
It is. Yeah. And yeah, whiskey is expensive. I'm just gonna say, I was looking at some tonight. This is totally off topic. Sorry, friends. But I was looking at some tonight from a local producer. It was like $38 for a small bottle. I don't know. I just don't want it that much.
Well, because I think, it has become so fashionable, like the really artisanal whiskeys. Like everyone's got to be fancy, like, oh, mine's imported from Japan and whatever.
Rum. Just get some rum, people. Buy rum.
I mean, look, I'm not knocking Japanese whiskey, by the way. I am fond, but I'm not spending all that money for a whiskey advent calendar. That's just not prudent. My budget can't take it.
You know what? Oh, also, I meant to mention for you crafty people, there are advent calendars. They sell them at Michael's that are just the wood that you can actually paint and fill yourself. So if you are a crafty person, you can totally do a do-it-yourself advent calendar for your kids and make it really special and something that they can associate to their own lives. So that's pretty neat too, if you have the time and the will and the wherewithal to do that.
Yeah, that would be a fun ongoing activity, like just paint one section a day.
Yes.
Messy, but fun. Okay. Awesome. Well, this is already going to be a longer episode than usual. Just because I couldn't shut up, to be honest. So I'll take the blame on that. So before we go, we have some great news. Every one of us this week has publication news. We each have something that has been published or will be published within 24 hours this week. So Erica and Seth, how about you tell us about what you guys have had published this week?
So Erica and I were published in the same collection of essay or papers on the topic is Mary Magdalene. It was a working group that we participated in at Loyola University Chicago. It was several years ago, actually, and it was collected into a volume and published. It was actually published in Italian a couple years ago. They translated the whole collection into Italian and published it there. But the English version came out in I know, Freudian slip. The English version came out in October of this year, and Erica and I both got our copies in the mail this week. So it is definitely not a stocking stuffer. It's a large book. It's a hardback. It's fully illustrated with color illustrations. I believe it retails for about $250. So definitely an investment. But it's a very nice volume.
So what is the name?
It's called Mary Magdalene, From the New Testament to the New Age and Beyond. And the editor is Edmondo Lupieri, who's a biblical scholar.
Chapter 9 and I'm chapter 14.
That's awesome. So people can find it on Amazon. They just got to be willing to fork out some cash for it.
That's exactly right.
Wow.
Which you should do.
Yes, you should buy their book.
Also,
so Seth, what is your chapter called?
My chapter is called Mary Magdalene in Medieval Hagiography.
And Erica, what's your chapter called?
My chapter is it's very, very long, and since I have a history of misreading things, I'm going to actually read it to you. From Disciple to Deviant, the Magdalene in Contemporary Popular Film.
Oh, yes, that's right. And it begins with a quote from Chumbawumba's Whatever Happened to Mary.
It does. And actually, it begins with Chumbawumba because I referenced the movie Stigmata, which is an awesome.
Wow.
Folks, we have to do a Stigmata
I
episode.
was just thinking that. There's so much. Okay.
Future episode, note to self.
Whenever we have a stigmatic saint, we have to pull that in.
We do.
Did I ever tell you about the episode of talking to Father Nichols about the Stigmata before I even officially joined Loyola?
No, what?
Oh my god. Oh, okay. That it's going to be a story for the
Stigmata episode.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, you have to tell me before though, not right now, but I want to hear this.
Okay.
Well, there's something else I was going to say about I don't know. But anyway, yeah, Erica and I do not get royalties from this book, so we just want you to read it because it would be edifying to your knowledge about Mary Magdalene. We are not getting paid for this at all. It goes on our CV, and that's about it.
On the other hand, the other publication I do get royalties for, and it is I have a short story being published. It's out on Kindle tomorrow, and then tomorrow being the 5th. We're recording this on the 4th. It is a science fiction short story, and it is being published. Tuscany Bay Books is publishing the Planetary Anthology series, which is a series of anthologies of short stories having to do with the different planets, and we're kind of having a loose definition. You could even say great bodies in the solar system. So they're putting out Pluto first, and then we're going to have the moon, and then after that, there's also going to be the sun, Earth, Jupiter, Saturn, Venus, Mercury. Some of those were previously published with Superversive Press. They're going to be re-released with Tuscany Bay. But again, tomorrow being published first on Kindle is the Pluto anthology, and I have a short story in that. And I don't want us to talk too much about it, but everything in the Pluto anthology will either deal with the planet Pluto or what the idea of Pluto and the deity, the pagan deity. So it might deal with death, great wealth. It might actually have Hades show up, or a 3-headed dog who's such a good boy. So if you want to read my story, it's called The Heart of Pluto. It does take place on the planet Pluto, but it's not necessarily straight science fiction. There's also some other really good authors. I know that Procera Brumley and A.M. Freeman are in it. And I'm kind of blanking on who some of the others are, but some other good names that I know. So it's going to be science fiction and fantasy. So you can get that on Kindle as of December 5th, and then it should be in paperback very shortly thereafter. So I would recommend it. Normally, I wouldn't recommend something like this as a Christmas gift, but if you have any goths, any disaffected teenagers that think they're super moody, absolutely, because it's all stories themed around death. It's going to be great. And as I said before, I will get some royalties out of it once they meet production costs. So absolutely, I'm pushing it. Buy. Get me some of that great wealth.
I can't wait to read your story. That sounds really cool. Also, did you say the series is called Great Bodies in the Solar System?
No, no, it's around, because if you say just planets, then someone's going to nitpick that the moon and the sun are not planets. Thankfully, the International Astronomical Union, I think that's what they're called, they made big headlines years ago when they said that Pluto was not a planet. Right. And there was, pushback, but now kind of official language is coming out that they're like, oh, now that we've learned more about various types of dwarf planets and exoplanets, blah, 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 we guess Pluto is a planet. And we were like, yeah, Pluto's a planet. So that's why I was saying it's about the big, the
Gotcha.
big, great, not like the hot,
Well,
not the hot bods of the
I
solar
was
system.
thinking that great bodies of the solar system sounds like one of those secular advent calendars Eric was talking about.
No, unfortunately, it's just, basically everything that's bigger than an asteroid, because we just didn't really want. How do you write an anthology around like Ceres and Vesta and all these other things? So it's just basically the major planets, the sun, Earth's moon.
Bigger than a bread box. Bigger than a bread box.
Yeah, on the solar system scale. So like Mars is going to be either about the planet or war and conquest, etc., etc. But yeah, Pluto's coming out tomorrow. I was happy to when I was in high school, I was a goth on the inside, but I went to an all-girls school where we wore a uniform. And so I really could never express my inner goth all that much. So I kind of can figure that this certifies me as legit. I actually published a story literally about death on the planet of death. So I'm excited. You should buy my book. Did I mention that? Buy my book. It's not even mine. I just have a story in it, but buy it anyway.
My high school nephews reminded me over Thanksgiving weekend that goths are no longer what they're called. They are called...
That's right, they're emo.
Emo, yes.
Emo.
Yeah. And my 25-year-old nephew just made me feel even older by telling me that that's been the change for a long time. You know what, people? I'm still...
Whatever.
I don't care.
Think goth is a better term because it harkens back to the Germanic tribes that conquered Rome. What did an emo do? He just cried in the corner. The Goths sacked Rome. Alaric the Goth sacked Rome.
Well,
whatever, millennials.
Had terrible bands like Typo Negative. So yeah, goths are better. That's all I have to say.
Kids these days. Rah!
Oh my goodness. All right, friends. It has been a fantastic night. Thank you for joining us on our voyage into the beginning of Christmas season with some detours into the Council of Nicaea and heresy and pickling of children. So we hope that taking that away with you, you'll join us next time. I don't know if we're going to talk about stigmata, but we will announce what we will talk about. Have a great week. Bye, y'all.
All right, bye.